He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
They say life is stranger than fiction.
If you take this beanstalk that's 10 meters diameter by 30,000 kilometers and you work out how much CO2 it needs to grow, you need about 3,000 kilometers cubed of air. And so that's 3/4 of the Grand Canyon. So overnight, 3/4 of the volume of the inside of the Grand Canyon has to rush into this tree and have all the CO2 come out as this beanstalk grows. If you lived near there, your house would probably be blown over.
Yeah, but sometimes what we see in movies or read in books is so incredible that it obviously couldn't be possible. Or could it?
So the idea is you have a tethered point on Earth and then another center of mass up at a geocentric orbit, which means it stays in the same spot above Earth. And then you hang a cable down between them. And then you just put little runners, little elevators that climb up that ladder. And then you're in space without using chemical propulsion. You just use sort of like a car that can drive up a bit of beanstalk.
I'm Brian Crump and welcome to Sci Fi, Sci Fact. In every episode, we bring in a scientist from New Zealand's MacDiarmid Institute to explain the theories behind some of fiction's more fantastic flights of fancy, if any theory exists. It's really another fantasy meets science edition of Sci Fi, Sci Fact, because we're talking about plausible scientific explanations or possibilities for Jack and his beanstalk.
3 beans?
3 beans?
Is it a trade or what?
You're gonna give me 3 lousy beans for my cow.
Take it or leave it.
I'll take it.
Hey! What generosity, what sacrifice!
Thank you.
You're welcome, no problem. De nada. Bit of shame. See you around, Jack.
And here to talk about those is Nathaniel Davis, Senior Lecturer at Victoria University Wellington in Physical Chemistry and Associate Investigator with the MacDiarmid Institute. Nate, where are we going with this? Is this genetic engineering or, I don't know, quantum mechanics?
Ideally, it is a bit of genetic engineering. As you'll see, we'll talk about the need to arrange carbon to make very tall structures, and plants are actually quite good at that. And if we could make them better at doing that, maybe we could unlock space, is what we're hoping to do.
The basic premise is Jack goes off to the market to get some food. He's suckered into buying some beans, and his mum is so angry that she chucks the beans out the window, at least one of them, and the bean overnight grows into this huge beanstalk that Jack climbs up to. Well, it's some kind of giant's kingdom up there, and then the story really starts. Nathaniel, I don't suppose you, in your research, found out what's the fastest growing plant on planet Earth at the moment?
I didn't, but I do remember maybe from high school that I think bamboo, it's hard to know because if you talk about plants, there's also unicellular plants, which probably grow quite quickly, like algae.
Okay,
but,
right.
But bamboo is a very fast growing. It might not be the fastest, but it's fast enough that I think we should mention bamboo is the answer.
It's not so fast you can see it growing, is it?
No, but I think it can grow something like 1 centimeter or 2 a day. I remember something about some torture or something where they strapped people to a bamboo bed that was still growing, and it can grow through people, which is a bit bleak, but it's very fast for a plant.
Yeah, well, you might have noticed, Nathaniel, that a lot of these fairy tales are really, really bleak and often quite violent.
Yeah, I actually found that apparently originally Jack and the Beanstalk was the story of Jack Spriggan's An Enchanted Bean in 1734. When it first came out, there wasn't any morality involved with it. He just kind of went up and murdered a giant and stole his stuff and came back down. It wasn't until later they realized that maybe kids should know that you shouldn't steal people's stuff. So that's where it came the story that he was stealing back his family heirlooms, that the geese, the harp were things that his family owned originally.
That's
he went
right.
And stole them.
The geese.
So the morality came later.
Did the goose lay a golden egg, or was that another fairy tale?
No, it did. It did lay a golden egg. I was actually a bit worried you might ask about that as a plausibility. So I did a bit of research about the possibility of something laying a golden egg.
Right. Well, we better get into that.
It didn't come up with much, but there is a deep sea snail that makes its shell out of iron sulfide. So basically a snail that grows a metal shell. They haven't found out exactly what does it yet. They think it's a bacteria that's producing the iron sulfide and growing the crystals. So there are animals that grow metal, but gold isn't very reactive. That's why we find it in the ground as gold and not gold sulfide or anything. So it might be hard to convince a bacteria to start making gold eggs for you. But there is something, it's not as crazy as it sounds, having an animal that produces metal objects.
Unless you had some incredible tolerance to toxicity and you could ingest arsenic, because isn't arsenic used to separate gold from the ore?
Yeah.
And then you'd excrete the gold.
If you feed a goose arsenic, it'd probably die. But maybe one of them survives and makes gold.
I'm intrigued about the snail, though. So are you saying it's a symbiotic relationship with some bacteria that leads to the iron shell?
Yeah, that's what they think. The paper suggested that they weren't 100% sure that in biology, the way you prove something is you sort of knock it out. So they were going to do gene engineering to either kill the bacteria or knock out the shell another way to prove that was the mechanism. But at the moment, they think it's likely a bacteria that's related to what live on those hydrothermal vents.
Is that where you find this particular snail?
It lives sort of near that area, but not exactly. It's not a vent snail, but it's in the sort of deep sea floor kind of area. So the bacteria migrating across doesn't seem too implausible.
What a remarkable relationship, though, if that is the case. And even if it isn't, what a remarkable creature.
Yeah, it looks really cool as well. I recommend people just Google the pictures. The scaly foot gastropod, Chromelismon squarifium. I definitely pronounced that wrong, but on its belly, it also grows these like plates as well as the shell. It just kind of looks like a little snail covered in like plate armor.
This snail is a fantastic tangent, but we better get back to the story now. So bamboo is probably the fastest growing, but it's still at a rate of maybe centimeters a day, not hundreds of feet overnight or meters or whatever. But in your search for something that might be equivalent, what did you come up with, Nate?
Well, so the first question is how big was it? And because you stepped over different sizes there. So I tried to work out how big this beanstalk had to be. And to do that, I just looked at the average cloud height in the UK, because we know he's an Englishman, because fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. And cloud heights depend on where you are in the world. If you're closer to the poles, your clouds are lower because the air is colder. And if you're in the tropics, your clouds are higher due to the warm air floating higher. So I looked at how high average clouds for the UK were, looked at a cumulonimbus, because there's a really nice cloud, and it's somewhere between sort of 200 meters and 21K. So that didn't really help. But I sort of suggested it be around 8 kilometers. If you go above 6 kilometers, you normally need like an oxygen tank. When you climb Everest, you need oxygen.
Yeah.
And the stories never mention an oxygen tank.
They don't.
But he's also climbing next to a giant beanstalk that's respiring. It's taking in CO2. It's producing oxygen. So maybe there is oxygen up there, but nothing ever gets that tall. So the tallest tree in the world is 116 meters. It's called Hyperion. It's a Californian redwood. People think maybe there were trees slightly taller than that we've already cut down, but it's reaching the upper limits. These researchers at Northern Arizona Uni calculated how high trees can get, and it's somewhere between 122 meters and 130 meters.
What limits the height of a tree?
The easiest way to say is it takes energy to get a leaf high. And so the taller the trees have smaller leaves. So the most tall trees are pine sort of shaped leaves. And as you take this leaf, you fight gravity. You take it high up. And the idea is you want to be taller than all the other trees to steal the sunlight from them. But it gets to a stage where you're actually growing the leaf at such height and bringing the water up and all the nutrients, the energy load of that is actually more than the leaf will produce through photosynthesis. So it becomes a net negative to your energy and your growth. And that's what stops the tree growing. So even though trees want to grow as tall as they can, gravity and energy needs means that they have this sort of limit around 120 meters high.
That's interesting, because I thought you'd tell me that it was actually a structural thing in terms of the root system that would be needed to keep a tree up at that height.
It definitely will become a structural thing, but at the moment, trees physically can get higher than what they grow to. So I think I found the tallest wooden structure ever was a radio tower that went down at the end of World War II, but it was 190 meters. And Japan plans to build a 350 meter skyscraper in Tokyo. So wood itself can go bigger than trees do. I know it's about roots and stuff, but roots are pretty strong. Trees grow a lot easier than our buildings. Like if you look at the buildings that get knocked down in earthquakes compared to trees, it's mainly this getting water and nutrients up to the top of the tree becomes a problem.
Now, this is another issue. You mentioned before, Nate, that the really tall trees tend to have smaller leaves, such as a redwood.
Yeah.
Beans tend to have rather big leaves.
Yeah, so beans are not the most well-known structural plant. I tried to find tensile strength of a bean plant, and all I found was a bunch of landscape architects telling me how much wiring I need to hang my beans off it. So beans are more of you put a support structure for your bean to grow.
Nate, what if something was coming down from the giant's kingdom?
Exactly. So that's where we sort of lean to now is what I want to talk about is a space elevator and the idea of having the beanstalk as a rope that's hanging and not so much as a tree that's supporting itself.
Are you talking about Jacob's ladder kind of scenario here?
Yeah. So the idea is you have a tethered point on Earth and then another center of mass up at a geocentric orbit, which means it stays in the same spot above Earth. And then you hang a cable down between them. And then you just put little runners, little elevators that climb up that ladder. And then you're in space without using chemical propulsion. You just use sort of like a car that can drive up a bit of beanstalk.
I find that a bit mind-blowing. Okay, there are lots of mind-blowing things going on here, Nate. But you know how if you send a rocket or any kind of machine up into space and you want it to escape the Earth's gravity, it's got to travel at over what? 7 kilometers a second, or is it 7 miles?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the escape velocity is, but it has to reach escape velocity. Yes.
Why?
But that's what it's doing. So even though it stays in the same spot above Earth, that means that point is moving the same speed as the Earth's rotating. So if you imagine you've got a ball on a string, and as you spin around, the ball on the string pulls away, the string becomes taut. Your hand itself isn't moving very fast. That's still the Earth rotating. But out the end of the string, it's actually got quite some speed to it because it has to make the same rotation that you are at a longer distance. And so once you get up to these points, it was about, I think, 30, here we go, at 53K kilometers from Earth, you reach escape velocity. And so you can basically get to the moon at 50.1 thousand kilometers. I mean, these are 1,000 kilometers. So 50.1 thousand kilometers from the Earth. If you went up on a bit of a string, you could just let go and you'd have enough speed to get to the moon without using any propulsion.
All we need is a cable that's 53 kilometers long.
Yeah. And that's the main thing is nothing we have is that strong. So I worked out that the values for wood, because we should talk about wood, is about 100 megapascals. Steel, 400. Carbon steel, the best sort of good steel we have, is about 840. And it's just too heavy for its strength. It basically becomes so heavy that it snaps itself. The only material we have at the moment that looks to be possible is carbon nanotubes. And so these are single-walled carbon tubes, kind of like graphene that's been folded up, or just a single tube made of carbon. And you can think of these as long cables. The problem at the moment, we can only make them, the best record I think is 55 centimeters. and we need them to be about kilometers long.
Mm.
A couple of years ago, we could only make them it started off being nanometers, then it was microns, then it's centimeters. So we are getting better at making these. And they think that maybe a sort of fibrous carbon nanotube thing could be strong enough to make one. There's a company who thinks they could build one for $6 billion, which seems like a lot of money, but I think it was something like the world's space budget for the last year was 40 billion. So it's within the order of magnitude that we're spending on space. It would just take a whole country, a whole world effort to combine to do it, I think. They did a calculation on how much it should cost. And so at the moment, I think it was thousands of dollars per kilo to get into space. And if you get it down to sort of the dollar regime of getting things up into space once it's built is the only problem. At the moment, chemical propulsion works. And these are still sort of the fictional sort of end of science, but still based in science.
Assuming we found a cable that could do the job, how are we going to get it up there?
So normally you would probably, I listened to a YouTube the other night of this physicist in America, and his plan was just to send a single thread up. You send the single thread up into space, and then you use that to then tow another thread and another thread and another, and you slowly build the cable from an existing individual strand. And then after you have enough, then you can start actually sending payloads up that actually have quite a bit of weight because the cable's strong enough. But I don't think carrying the cable straight up by itself, that would use a lot of energy.
But a thread of what? A thread of this nano cable that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, most probably a thread of this nano cable. There are also things about, and why it sort of brings it back to plants, is they found new structures of nanocellulose, these nanocellulose fiber crystals, which plants can make, or also made by bacteria. And when you mix them into fibers, they're getting sort of up to the stage where they're strong enough to maybe be doing this kind of material. And so maybe if we had a plant that could grow these, that would be the quickest way, some sort of amazingly genetically modified plant that grows into a thick, strong rope.
Well, as he pointed out, if the beanstalk wouldn't get up, and because photosynthesis cannot produce sufficient energy, once you get to a certain height, as you pointed out, the leaves, it's not a net gain anymore, it's a net loss, and so there's no point in the tree producing leaves at a greater height. And at the moment, the tallest redwoods are about 100 meters. But if the hard work has been done, in other words, the structure is there, the foundation is there, it can just be a climber. And climbers can go for miles and miles, can't they?
Yeah. If there was already a tiny string, you could send the beanstalk up the climber. The interesting thing is what happens if you grow a beanstalk that big. So I did a few calculations, and I set the diameter of the beanstalk to be 10 meters, which sort of looks like the pictures from Jack and the Beanstalk. And there's a tree called the Arbol del Tul tree, which is the world's widest tree, and its diameter is about 11.6 meters. So it wasn't too crazy. The only crazy thing was I set it to be 35,000 kilometers high. But if you take this beanstalk that's 10 meters diameter by 30,000 kilometers, and you work out how much CO2 it needs to grow, and I modeled it as a tree because most of the calculations on biomass for carbon sequestration comes from the forestry industry and not the bean industry. So there's no numbers for beanstalks. But I went to the redwoods area in Rotorua the other day, and there was a lot of good information on forestry and carbon sequestering. But it works out to need about, in terms of CO2, 20 billion meters cubed, which number doesn't really matter yet because you got to work out how heavy the tree is. So it's how dense the carbon is. So I couldn't use hardwood or softwood pine. So I went for slightly below what softwood pine is, about 300 kilograms per meters cubed, because Jack cuts it with an axe. So it can't be too tough.
Yeah.
And so you need about 6 billion tons of carbon. And you know that there's about 2 kilograms per meter squared of carbon. And so you work out you need about 3,000 kilometers cubed of air. And so that's 3/4 of the Grand Canyon. So overnight, 3/4 of the volume of the inside of the Grand Canyon has to rush into this tree and have all the CO2 come out as this beanstalk grows. So overnight, it would be, if you lived near there, your house would probably be blown over.
Yeah.
And you'd wake up to the sound of this rushing wind. It also, while it's sequestering so much carbon, you could think about ways to combat climate change. And so I calculated to remove enough CO2 to go back to pre-industrial CO2 levels, you need 155 trees, which seems like a big number, but it's also quite small considering there's 390 billion trees in the Amazon.
I just reckon
cut down 1.3 million a year.
Jack's
155.
Jack's beanstalk could be going overboard. If there are 200 of those, we'd suddenly be back in an ice age.
Yeah, it'd be too. So we've got to be careful. The interesting thing also is the amount of nitrogen it needs to grow. So plants need nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, and water, basically. And so I worked out how much nitrogen was in the soil of New Zealand. You can only go about 2 meters down, which isn't probably true for a big beanstalk that extends kilometers into the air. But it basically pulls out all the nitrogen in the soil of each island. So you can only grow one on the North Island and one on the South Island because it needs about 119,000 kilometers squared of landmass. And the North Island is 113,000 and the South Island's 150,000. So if we grew one in New Zealand on one of the islands, you wouldn't be able to grow anything else basically again because all the nitrogen in the soil would be gone.
Unless you bought a whole lot of urea fertilizer, you just have to import a whole lot of that.
Yeah, you refertilize or wait because bacteria can turn nitrogen into a fixable source from the air. But it is sort of amazing what it does. It also,
I mean, beans do fix nitrogen, don't they?
Yeah. Mostly in their roots. There's these rhizoid root systems at the very tip of their roots, where most plants do their nitrogen fixing through a bit of the soil. Which it works as a slow process, but a quick process to grow overnight would be devastating to the nitrogen.
It wouldn't be getting the nitrogen from the air; it would be getting it from the soil, and then it might get some of it back for the soil.
Yeah, most of it grows into sort of protein complexes and things. But
Yes.
over time, it
beans.
could make more nitrogen, such as beans, which are a good source of protein.
Getting back to getting an elevator up there. So you said we could take it, build it one thread at a time, this cable. But how are we going to do that without getting the thing horribly tangled? What would we take it up in, a rocket? And how would you do that?
Yeah, so you'd probably put a satellite in geosynchronous orbit. You'd put some sort of mass there, and then you'd shoot up the single thread up to that point, and then attach it there, and then dangle it down, and then let that attach to the ground point. Sort of like a big grappling hook, but with the satellite and the mass already there to grab onto it.
Nate, did you look at whether there's any sweet spot in terms of where we might put an elevator like this, which is achievable, but also provides some benefit in terms of getting things up? It saves a lot of the energy costs of getting satellites up into space, and maybe even provides a springboard for us to go beyond Earth.
The main thing, so on Earth, they all have to be on the equator. Pretty much, you get more speed there, so they are a lot easier to build. If we have access to the whole solar system from our first space elevator, the other ones to build are a lot easier. If you build them on the moon or Mars, you have less gravity if it's spinning faster. So there are places in the solar system that are better, but for Earth, you want to put it on the equator.
And if we did put it on the equator, would you put it up to 53 kilometers, so at escape velocity, or would you something lower that would still get you up a fair bit of the way?
It's actually interesting. There's a couple of things that do with this. It's called tapering. Imagine a giant wedge where one end of the tether is longer than the bit that's connected to Earth. And that just lets you balance a lot of the weight and a lot of the different physics sort of strain and calculations there by having a weight further out. So I think if we actually built one, it probably would go a bit past geocentric orbit to give us a little speed. if we could, it would, building one that let us launch things at escape velocity would be amazing. But building one at all would be amazing. Maybe the first one we build, we still have to use some rockets at the top of it. And maybe the second one is a bit bigger.
What would be in the elevator? Just a standard lift?
It depends. Whatever. You would be limited by the strength of your cable. But otherwise, you could have whole rockets going up that. You could have the amount of area is actually amazing. Like it would take days, depending on what speed you're going. But you could be on this elevator for days. So you could have like a hotel or something, depending on what you're catering for. If it's a tourism industry to start with, it would probably just be the simple stuff that we want to ship to space. Maybe we keep our rocket ships in orbit and we just take our payloads to take to a moon base or something. So just food or something. Once it's built, that's the best thing. You can, as long as you can build an elevator like it, then you can take it up. Whereas at the moment, rockets are very, very lightweight because the more weight, the more energy you use. In this case, you use a bit more energy, but it scales differently because you've got that cable to pull on.
And I assume that if it can go up, it can go down.
Yep. Yeah, it would also be an interesting way to get in. So getting back to Earth's quite easy because you just sort of fall as long as you've got heat shields and ways to land. But this would mean that we wouldn't have to put that on our shuttles because we could just land someone at the space station above the Earth. They could hop on the elevator and go home.
Wouldn't we still need a huge amount of energy to power the elevator?
Yeah, but it's less energy. So one of the ways they think is having a laser. So you put a massive laser at the base and you aim it up, and then your space elevator has a little solar panel array. And so you hit the solar panels on your space elevator, and that's how it runs up. And it needs relatively little energy compared to what it's doing. If it's got a little tread or gear system, a lot of that energy is very efficiently converted to forward momentum. So it's definitely a lot less energy than pushing something up with rockets.
It does sound like a plausible solution to that problem of the incredible expense involved in getting things up into orbit and bringing things back so we can reuse them.
Yeah, it's just hard to make. And also there's a lot of sort of near-Earth satellites now, like space junk, space rubbish, which is also a problem because if you have a big, very fragile but strong sort of rope, you don't want stuff crashing into it. So basically anything that's in space can't go near it. So that's another issue people have been worried about in the actual using of these things. Space doesn't have infinite room. And so maybe we should be careful what we put up there. But at the moment, I think it's like a learning curve. Hopefully we find a way to clear up space later when we know what we're doing. But for now, we're probably just got to give it a go.
Is there anyone who's actually working on this, or is it just still at the moment because the nano cable that we've got at the moment is only 0.5 meter long? We haven't reached that point where people are working on the project.
There's definitely people working on it. It was part of one of NASA's like new ideas that got a bit of funding for the research, and they wrote some papers about it. And it at the moment, it just comes down to, can we have a material that's strong enough? And these nanotubes are strong enough if you can make them kilometers long. And then the next question is, can we physically build it? It would be the biggest structure humans have ever made. And that's, I think, quite daunting for a world that's also thinking about feeding people to spend so much on one thing. But there's definitely people out there working on it. There's this guy who thinks he can do it in the next however many years. He's probably a bit too ambitious, but there is hope that once we get these materials, there's no reason we can't.
Returning back to the original story, Jack and the Beanstalk. So say Jack takes this elevator up into space, has a bit of jam with some giant and has to retreat. If Jack came back down, would he be able to chop this elevator down before the giant got there?
Not if it was actually a space elevator. His axe wouldn't be able to go through these carbon nanotubes at all. Maybe if he had a super space axe.
And the other thing is, isn't it tethered to that geostationary point up there? So actually, if you were to disconnect it, you'd have to do it at the top, wouldn't you?
So it depends. If it breaks, that's another thing people are worried about. There's all these pictures of thousands of kilometers of this wire falling down and crushing the whole world. But actually, it ends up, as it breaks from the top, as the thing falls, it changes its angle, because you can imagine it falling to sort of the left or right, and it changes its speed, and it actually speeds up, and then it snaps from the bottom, and then that floats up as well and basically flies off into space if it breaks. So it's not too dangerous if you cut it down. And he'd still be, so if Jack went up and met a giant at geosynchronous orbit and stole some stuff from him and came down and cut this space elevator, the giant should be still fine on his geosynchronous orbit somewhere above the UK.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sci Fi Sci Fact, hosted by me, Brian Crump, produced by Andrew Robertson, and of course, made possible thanks to the incredible knowledge of those brilliant scientists at the MacDiarmid Institute. You can find more episodes of Sci Fi Sci Fact on the RNZ podcast page. RNZ's podcasts are also available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify and iHeartRadio, or pretty much wherever you find your podcasts. And make sure to follow us so you don't miss out on any new episodes.